Next time on Death Battle.
I bet.
Before we start the video, here's a couple of shameless plugs. I recently just passed 1,000 followers on TikTok. This is where I bring up the fact that I have a flip-flop.
Marker.
This is where I bring up the fact that I have a flip-flop. If you also have a dick cock, then you should follow me on Lip Lock. Oh, and also follow me on Twitter because I said so, and also I like having followers on Twitter. A hard pill that a lot of JJK fans are going to have to swallow is that Mahito is actually not the strongest of the disaster curses. This is something that I actually had a lot of trouble figuring out, especially when I first started reading JJK. Mahito is given so much more spotlight than the other disaster curses, especially since he seems to spend the most time with Kenjaku, the guy pulling the strings behind pretty much everything. It's only natural to assume that he is the most powerful. On top of that, if you look this up online, you'll find multiple articles and sources citing Mahito as, again, the strongest of the disaster curses. But this is not true. In fact, I think all of these guys are stuck in a Kid Buu versus Buuhan debate, where, at least in the manga, Buuhan is generally considered the most powerful of all the Buus. Yet Kid Buu is considered the most dangerous as he lacks intelligence and is more animalistic and ferocious. Similarly, Mahito is not the most powerful of the disaster curses, instead he is the most dangerous, as his curse technique is able to kill you pretty much instantly if he touches you, and his domain expansion is near unbeatable, as your soul is literally in the palm of his hand, as is described in the manga. But I'm kind of getting ahead of myself. I just need to establish that because a lot of people seem to hype up Mahito as the most powerful, when in actuality he is weaker than Jogo pretty much objectively. We know this because a first grade sorcerer named Nanami was able to have a pretty pitched fight with Mahito until he went into overtime and actually grew more powerful, with both Yuji and Nanami putting the hands on Mahito so badly that he actually unlocked his domain expansion, a la some Super Saiyan break your limits bullshit. Compare this to Jogo, where in the Shibuya incident, Nanami actually comments that he is on a completely different level from any of the other disaster curses. Supporting this is Kenjaku, who estimates that Jogo is worth about 8 or 9 of Sukuna's fingers. This is, even in their words, a generous estimate, but compare this to Mahito, who gets pretty much no-diffed by a 3-finger Sukuna. Yeah. Making this even worse, Mahito has absolutely no chance in hell scaling to Jogo's meteor, which in the Jujutsu Kaisen fanbook is actually stated to be able to turn buildings into ash and dust, with calcs usually putting this at large town level. However, these calcs actually leave out crucial information, as it's confirmed in other JJK guidebooks that this meteor actually caused an earthquake in Japan. With that taken into account, it upscales the meteor to small city level. Small city level is actually decently consistent, as a 15-finger Sukuna remarks that this would have hurt him had it actually hit him. And later, while domain amped, Sukuna is able to destroy a very large portion of Shibuya, which has been calced to city level plus. Which again, all of this is stuff that Mahito would not scale to. However, that doesn't mean that we don't have anything to scale Mahito off of, as he does actually have a couple fights in the manga. As well, he should just be logically stronger than other characters. For example, while he might not be stronger than Jogo, you could make the argument he is the second strongest disaster curse, as when Nanami fights Dagon during the Shibuya incident, he makes no comment on Dagon's strength, despite Dagon actually being domain amped. So you could make the argument that Mahito is stronger than a domain amped Dagon. But this scaling really only matters if you think that domains scale, which we'll talk about later. But if we're only sticking to the conservative scaling for now, Mahito has some pretty decent city block level stuff, scaling above the second finger bearer, scaling above Mekumaro's ultimate cannon during the Kyoto Goodwill event, or his body repel technique being able to shake the Shibuya subway systems, which has been calced to about city block level. However, the anime actually makes this feat more impressive by showcasing much more violent shaking, which would actually amp the calc up to small town level, which is actually consistent with Jogo's meteor being large town level to small city level. When it comes to his speed, I don't really have too much to say on that. His most recent feat in the manga was him being able to speed blitz Yuji, who had just had a 50-50 fight with Choso's piercing blood, which is stated to exceed the speed of sound, and has calcs putting it at Mach 1.5, meaning it's actually consistent. Furthermore, Mahito is able to amp his base stats with things like domain expansion, black flash, and instant spirit body of distorted killing, but we'll talk about that later when we get to the hacks portion. Okay, we're going to do a little Shiggy scaling, and then we're going to get to the actual hacks portion of the video. This shouldn't take too long, because Shigaraki has actual feats in the manga and anime, unlike someone else, but he also has statements that directly put him above other top tier characters, which we'll cover in a minute. Let's cover his speed really quick, because it's actually kind of embarrassing how badly this gaps. My Hero Academia mainly follows Class 1A, in which we have a student in there that is able to shoot a laser from their navel cavity. It sounds weird, it is weird, but just go with it for now. This laser is confirmed multiple times across several sources to actually be made up of light. One of the biggest debacles in power scaling is whether or not a laser in fiction is actually moving at the speed of light, as some people will argue that these are simply made up of radioactive waves or something similarly. But in My Hero Academia, this actually isn't an issue. It's literally just confirmed to be light multiple times, in which even much weaker characters are able to react to it and even bend it away, which is all stuff that Shigaraki would scale to, along with other feats in the manga like Stars and Stripes being able to dodge radio waves, but we don't actually need that for this. But it does strengthen the light speed argument, and since Shigaraki is able to speed blitz Stars and Stripes, obviously he scales to this. Shigaraki is consistently compared to All Might in his prime, multiple times across the anime, manga, and even promotional material. It's actually one of the most consistent notions in power scaling I have ever seen. On top of this, Shigaraki has actual feats to prove that he is at least as strong, if not more powerful, than Prime All Might. Prime All Might actually having multi-continental level scaling, which is actually consistent across the series. For example, in the My Hero Academia movies, Deku and Bakugo were able to do a multi-continental feat together. Some people might argue that the movies aren't canon, however, as far as I can tell, they are canon to the anime, which is somewhat synonymous with the manga, so I'll give it to him. It's not like it really upscales Shigaraki either, as Deku is basically able to perform a multi-continental level feat on his own towards the end of the manga. There really isn't too much to cover for Shigaraki, especially when the stat difference is this egregious. I mean, if you've been paying attention to the video so far, we have a multi-continental Shigaraki with faster than light speed scaling versus a small town level Mahito who isn't even Mach 2. But stats aren't everything, especially in a fight like this, which is when we actually get to talk about their hacks abilities.
But at least now it can't get much worse.
But it did get worse.
Both Shigaraki and Mahito are incredibly finely tuned characters, both having many extra abilities that make them insanely overpowered, at least in context to their verses. That's actually why this matchup was so interesting to me, as both of these characters have so many moving parts to them that it actually makes deciding a victor kinda difficult, unless you do your research like I have now. For Shigaraki, he uses his quirk, Decay, which is able to disintegrate pretty much anything he touches. For Mahito, it's his cursed technique, Idol Transfiguration, where he manipulates the shape of your soul, turning you into something that's no longer human. I want to go over a few stat increasing hacks abilities that Mahito has access to, and why they probably won't be too much help for this fight. Black Flash increases the energy behind an attack by an exponent of 2.5, as is confirmed in the manga and by the author Gege. Regardless, even if you do factor this in, it doesn't really upscale Mahito too much. If you take his small town level feat that we talked about earlier during his section, and multiply it with an exponent of 2.5, that only gets him up to town level. A little disclaimer here, Black Flash is notorious for power scalers, as depending on whether or not you use joules or kilojoules, the result will be wildly different. Mahito also has his domain expansion, which amps the stats of the users, as is confirmed in the manga. We'll talk about the exact effects of that later when we get to the more detailed portion. Finally, probably one of the most metal designs for a villain in shonen, Instant Spirit Body of Disordered Killing, which is a binding vow that Mahito makes, releasing his true soul and increasing his stats by 200%. However, even that wouldn't amp Mahito that much, and even with Black Flash, this guy still isn't getting past town level. Now to get into the actual meat and potatoes of this portion, that being Decay versus Idol Transfiguration. A lot of JJK fans like to make memes about Mahito, saying that characters without soul damage aren't going to do anything against him. Shigaraki actually doesn't have this issue, as he has actually used Decay on people's souls before. This was most clearly showcased during the final fight against Deku, where Deku actually goes into Shigaraki's soul to try and save him. With Shigaraki using his quirk against Deku's soul, affecting Deku's real body. It's actually kinda metal out of context. The main point I'm trying to make here though, is that Shigaraki can hurt Mahito's soul. One Decay and the fight might actually just end there and then. As if Mahito couldn't take any more L's, his own cursed technique, Idol Transfiguration, is absolutely worthless in this fight. This is because Shigaraki's body actually holds multiple vestiges, including All for One, meaning we have a sort of Yuji and Sukuna situation here, where if Mahito tries to use Idol Transfiguration, he'll be touching a forbidden soul, that being All for One or one of the other vestiges inside of Shigaraki, which makes his domain expansion a pretty much instant loss if he pulls it out. As is described in the manga, when you're inside of his domain, your soul is literally in the palm of his hand. Just like when Yuji broke into his domain, and he ended up touching Sukuna's soul in the process, if Mahito used his domain against Shigi, he would be touching all of the vestiges inside of him. When you take into account everything these characters can do, Mahito has no valid win cons, while this fight seems almost rigged in Shigaraki's favor. If I was Death Battle and I was told that Mahito has to win, or at the very least it can't look like Mahito lost that badly, what would I do? Number 1, make Mahito really strong. They can do this a few different ways, saying that domain scale, claiming that Mahito, after he performs his binding vow, is the strongest disaster curse. Both of these would grant Mahito some pretty decent mountain level scaling, as Dagon's domain has been calced to mountain level, and obviously Jogo's domain is literally a mountain. However, obviously Dagon's domain is an entire island, so some people would argue that this should be island level. However, calcs take this even further, saying that Dagon's domain would be country level, if not higher, which is similar with Jogo's meteor. The Jujutsu Kaisen fanbook actually highlights that this meteor is able to turn buildings into dust and ash. Taking that into account, calcs have put this attack at country level. Obviously, country level is still way below continental or multi-continental, but it definitely sounds a lot closer than our small town level Mahito from earlier. If they really want to be desperate though, they can use the back of the Jujutsu Kaisen volume covers, which state that even one of Sukuna's fingers has the power to destroy the world, with Mahito arguably being around the level of 2-finger Sukuna, if not weaker, but at the very least should exceed the power of one of Sukuna's fingers. They could also implement downplay for Shigaraki, like saying that his planetary statements don't apply, or that the laser that I've been using to scale Shigaraki isn't actually made of light, despite what the actual series says. And instead go with some older calcs that I actually used in my Deku vs. Asta video, saying that Deku only just reached the speed of light towards the end of his series, and claiming that Shigaraki wouldn't actually scale to this. They could potentially claim that while Shigaraki might be stronger a little bit and faster a little bit, he doesn't have any way to harm Mahito's soul, which we know is not true, as we covered earlier, but Death Battle might try to play that card. Also in Jujutsu Kaisen, there are a couple throwaway lines implying that punches without cursed energy won't harm a cursed spirit. Since Shigaraki doesn't actually have cursed energy, or any equivalent of it like Ki from Dragon Ball, Death Battle could argue that Shigaraki's punches aren't going to do anything to him. Anyway.
We already know the